live. Good morning, it's Monday, the 17th of July, 2023, and I'm reading out of Life as Carola. Here is an unusual book that shines with fire, the New York Times. Joan Grant lived until 1989, and she was a writer of her own farm memories. This is the memory as Carola. Carola was born on the 4th of May in 1510, so it's the 16th century we are in here now. She was in a convent, was tortured and rescued by Carlos. She is now married to Carlos. Exiles from Eden. In the story of Adam and Eve there is a truth which has been forgotten, a truth taught in parables since earth was young. The Church maintains that the serpent of evil knowledge tempted man and women to lust after each other, and because they listened, they were cast out of Eden. Yet, in the days when the meaning of this legend was understood, the serpent symbolized not evil knowledge, but wisdom. It was taken as the symbol of wisdom, because it can make itself into a circle, that circle to which we attain when the past and the future are joined. When Adam and Eve were born of God, they knew no evil, and knowing no evil, they knew no good, for good is the overthrowing of evil. For a time they were content, but as they grew older, they began to be aware of the loneliness which had come with their separation from the Father. They asked the serpent, who was coiled under the tree of life, how they could return to the land whence they had been born. And the serpent answered, "If you would see him again, you must go forth into earth and eat of the fruit of destruction until you learn to create." So Adam and Eve set out on a long journey. At first they were unarmed, for they had not yet wrestled the sword of courage from the hand of fear. When they saw danger, they fled into the shadows, but pain followed them into their hiding place and bound them prisoner. They cried out in torment, but no one answered them, until endurance came to give them their first weapon. It was a dagger, and though it was still blunt, written on the blade they saw, "The trained will, which one day shall cut all fetters." Time passed, and Adam and Eve became leaders of men. Pride was appointed their seneschal, and he beguiled them with false counsel, for they had yet to learn that though he is a good servant, he must never be allowed to take command. So they listened to him until their leadership was taken from them, lest they should betray their followers. They walked through the barren valleys, and at last came to the house of humility, where the wounds of their feet were healed, and the dust laved from their eyes. Then humility summoned them to audience, and they saw her enthroned with pride at her right side, and pride said to them, "Now that you have come to the house of my sister, you need fear me no longer, for you will never see me except at her side, and together we have become your friend." Then were Adam and Eve given great riches, and they used them to surround their house with a wall of gold as protection from the world. But a plague fell upon their estate, and when they tried to flee the pestilence, they found their gateway had vanished, and an unbroken wall imprisoned them. They were alone, save for a leper who shuffled after them down echoing corridors. They dared not sleep, for always they must be ready to run from the sound of his bell. They grew weary, and he came so near they could hear the breath whistling from the gaping holes that once had been his nose, could smell the rotting bones in his white flesh. At last he touched them, and they found they were even as he. At the summons of the leper's bells, the wall cracked open, and they passed through into the road again. The day came when they saw a fig tree growing by the wayside. They longed to refresh themselves from its fruit, but they stood aside to allow other pilgrims to eat. Then they saw a stranger coming towards them, and they rang their bell to warn him they were unclean. He took no heed and led them to a spring of living water, saying, "Put off your leper's robes and bathe." And they obeyed him. And they found their flesh was whole again. The stranger asked them, "Do you want lepers' robes and staves and begging bowls, or shall I cast them away?" And they answered, "Let us be naked, for though we have nothing, we are clean." Then the stranger gave each a new garment and a new staff, and showed them the path to the hills. And he said to them in parting, "Remember, all possessions which you do not share become a leper's possession, which no one will share." So Adam and Eve continued on their journey until they shall see the green meadows of heaven, which they once knew as Eden. Chapter 23. Blind Alley. On the morning when I woke, knowing everything that had happened to Lucia since the day I left her to ride up into the hills, I went to Carlos to tell him of what I had seen. While I was telling him of Lucia, I forgot I was Carola, the wife of Carlos, and was again a strolling player. I know he tried to comfort me, but I was so caught up in the reality of what I was describing that I remember nothing but my own words. When Petruccio told me that Lucia had died, it was only a few months after we parted from her that he heard of it. He let me think it was of the plague. Now I know she killed herself, because she could not escape from the shackles which held her to Bernard. While we were both on earth, I tried to speak to bring back her pride, told her that no human being must depend on another to this extremity, but it wasn't any use. Whatever Bernard did to her, she never complained. She used to follow him about humbly as a cur. She didn't even cry out when he hit her, and she never tried to make him jealous or angry, but just wept and obeyed and adored him. It was not even as if she lusted after him, because after she had had the pox, I don't think she was ever really well enough to be eager-loined. At least, she said she wasn't. I wonder if in the past it had been he who had been importunate, and she who scorned. Or what was the purpose that made her stay with him, even though he had turned her from a laughing harlot into a pitiful drab, from a proud courtesan into a cringent supplicant for his favours? The old Lucia would have let no man ill-treat her, but she, who had once seen men grovel on the floor because she spurned them, now was without artifice, for her obsession for Bernard had taken away all her weapons. I think that gradually he had become to hate her. It is often that men and women hate the one to whom they bring sorrow, for in their hearts they know that to give sorrow is to receive it. In her eyes he must have seen himself as cruel and pitiless. Perhaps he even began to find it difficult to believe in his own boasts. If it is true that women learn only through sorrow, I don't think Lucia can have learned anything until she loved Bernard. She knew that it was to be cold. She knew what it was to be cold or hungry or frightened, for these are all very familiar to strolling players, if they are women. But I don't think she had ever really been unhappy. Bernard taught her unhappiness, but she could not learn what unhappiness would have taught her, and so she killed herself. He finally deserted her at an inn where some mummers she had once known were staying. Mummers. He may have thought she would be safe with them, or it may have been that he was too weary of her importunities to care what happened to her. He left her a gold piece, knowing him, I think it was his last, for he was always generous with money if he had any. When she knew she would never see him again, she went into a little church outside the village to pray before the statue of St. Cecilia for courage. But the Latin words beat a rhythm in her head. Bernard, Bernard, and she knew that he was the only God she believed in anymore. Lucia no longer hoped for love potions, yet once more she went to an alchemist. She told him she wanted poison to kill a dog that raided her hen roost, but he must have seen how desperate she was, for he made her pay the gold for it. She hid the phial in her bodice and felt it cold as death between her tired breasts as she walked slowly back to the inn. She swept out her little room and covered her bed straw with her cloak. Then she lit a candle at the head and the foot of the pallet, as if she were trying to make a bier for one she loved. To her it was a bier for love itself. She made a crucifix of 2 sticks tied together with a strand of her hair, and kneeling before it, she drank the poison. When the pain began, she lay down with her hands crossed on her breast, waiting for death to bring her peace. But even the alchemist had cheated her. She took a long time to die. The pain grew stronger. She tried to stop herself being sick because she knew she had no money to buy more poison. Then the pain grew so terrible that she did not mind what happened, even if it meant she had to go on living, if only the pain would stop. The candles she had set were overturned. She writhed and struggled as though something was trying to tear out her bowels with iron claws. She forgot she was a woman. She was an animal, fighting against pain, and then being devoured by it, until it seemed that there was no pain in the universe that was not in her own body. Then pain was no longer savage, but laid its heavy paws across her body to wait for her to die. She kept crying for water, but no one heard her, and she was too weak to crawl to the door. She forgot she had given me the crucifix, and her hand kept fumbling at the pallid flesh of her neck to feel for its comfort. She died calling on Bernard's name, as if he were Saint Anthony of the Holy Virgin. I shall never be able to forget the sound of her voice. Bernard, Bernard, Bernard. Her body was thrown into a plague pit, for the innkeeper was afraid that if it were known she had killed herself, his patrons might think that her ghost walked. He could not know that Lucia still lodged at his inn. She was no longer in pain, but she was in the dark, crying for Bernard and hearing only the silence. She did not know she had done it over and over again. She thought it was happening for the first time. I know I have tried to go to her, but always someone held me back and told me that her time for release had not yet come. Yet she is free now, for last night I saw her in her peace. She was dressed like the wife of a doge, in silver brocade and a cloak of crimson velvet, sitting by a window which opened to a fair landscape. A little Negro page stood by her chair holding an open comfit box, and on a table ready to her hand there was a gold wine flagon and a single goblet. I asked her if she remembered Bernard, but her eyes never changed, and she went on smiling, and I knew she had forgotten him. When I finished, Carlos sat very still, staring out of the window as if he were trying to read a secret written in the clouds. Then he spoke. Sometimes I feel that in your philosophy there are terrors which only those who are born of courage dare to contemplate. The Church offers us heaven and hell, telling us little of purgatory save that it is the shadow anteroom to paradise. Yet their vision of hell has no reality for me, and I see their demons feeding the eternal fires only as monstrous puppets, set to frighten children. But when you speak of what the soul must undergo, there is a quality in your words which makes them live in my mind. You have told me of the immutable justice by which we are ruled. You know of it as part of that same law which orders the waxing of the moon and summons the sun to each day's journey. Yet you have told me a story wherein I can see no justice, the story of a woman driven by circumstance, driven beyond her strength to a pitiful death. You speak of death as if he were your friend. I've heard you call him the great innkeeper, the great physician. Yet the death who came to Lucia was without pity, a dark destroyer who imprisoned her. Where is your justice that you talk of as the great law if this should be done? You have told me that there is no punishment for sin, but only a reaping. Why did she gather such a bitter harvest? Only death may open the door of his inn, and he who tries to enter as a felon may be imprisoned. I have told you, as Patricio first told it to me, that God does not give his children a burden they cannot carry, if they will but use their strength. His heart sorrows while their shoulders are bowed, and they cannot look up to his face and smile. But it is a strange burden, for even he cannot take it from them. They must carry it until it has vanished. Each time that we are born there is a road which we must travel. In it there are valleys and mountains, wine shops and prisons. The road is not of our choosing, though it was made by us long since, but the manner of our journey lies in our own hands. The time we must spend on the road is allotted by God, and it has been decreed by him that we must wait for death to summon us home. If this were not so, all of us who can see a little beyond the limitations of the flesh would put off our bodies like a leper's cloak, for beyond death there is all that we long to find on earth in its perfection. He broke in, but Lucia had no knowledge. How can she be condemned? It must be that in the past she has sought the same way of escape, had been told that it was not well, but did not listen, though her ears were open, for the gods do not speak to the deaf. It was by her own action that she took poison. Her death, her pain even, I can understand, but why was she left alone, crying for Bernard? Did she know she cried for him for how long? 5 years? For her, time would not be measured as we know it. I heard her voice, Bernard, Bernard, the voice following, the words following each other in the sweeping rhythm of a scythe. For I was outside her hell. I knew that time passed, but for her it stood still. She could not see the hand that turned the hourglass. She could only see the sand of the present. But why? Why? She was bound into the present, cut off not only from time, but from her own spirit. So when the water from her journey as Lucia returned into the jar of her experience, with it will go a memory so strong that she will never again seek the same way of escape, the escape that is no escape. How do you know? How can you know? Because once I too received a warning to which I would not listen. Then I was made to hear that voice which to some of us is louder than the voice of any other teacher, the voice of my own experience. I remember a knife that searched for my heart. My own hand held that knife, hoping for death, hoping only for oblivion. I tried to drive it further and further up under my ribs. Each time I thought, this is the last pain. I do not know how long I was there, a day, a year, a century, but I will never again attempt that same futility. You think that all who die by their own hand are cowards or fools? Only those who try to escape from life. For there is no escape from thought or feeling in the little incident of the body's death. Yet I have known of men who have died by their own hand in glory, for they were not trying to escape. I will tell you a story. I was shown it away from earth. I cannot remember by whom or in what millennium it happened. Once there was a man whose people were besieged in a city built on the edge of a cliff above a river. It was a country where there are strange trees and birds of vivid plumage, such as I have never seen on earth. There was a secret way out of the city, and by it the man tried to pass the enemy encampment with a message for succor to a friendly tribe. But he was taken prisoner. His captors tortured him. They knew he could show them the way the city could be taken if they could make him betray his people. I will not tell you what they did to him, except that with pain they were very supple. Then they shut him in a dark hut, for they were afraid that if for a few hours he was not left unmolested, he would die under their hands, as he prayed to do in silence. He knew that his last endurance had been reached, that he could bear no more pain, and tomorrow would betray even his gods if that were demanded of him. He knew there was only one way to assure that the secret way would never be revealed by him. His hands were bound behind him with a rawhide thong, but he was able to chafe his wrists against a sharp stone until he opened a vein, not through fear of torture, but to protect his people from the peril of his tongue. He thought he died as a coward, wept for the weakness of his flesh, which he dared not trust to defend his spirit, and as he felt the blood trickle over his crippled hands, it seemed as though all honour and courage seeped away with it. Then he heard a great shout ring through the silence, the shout of warriors welcoming a hero to their ranks, and he found that on his head was the thorned helmet of the great hunters, and round him were the wearers of the scarlet, to whom he had become brother in splendour. And what of those who kill themselves when they have gone mad? What is madness? Sometimes it is only that one is born wiser than the people one must live among. A seer or a visionary might seem a lunatic to a merchant, and a cardinal thought a cretin in a country of the wise. Carola, I once had a friend who was seized by a melancholy, as other men are seized by a pox. It was as though he lived in a shroud of grief. He had possessions, but he shut himself away from them. He had a beloved wife, but he refused to see her. His family were afraid he would destroy himself, so he was always watched from behind the arras. But at last he escaped them, and strangled himself with the sleeve of his bedgown. What of him? I can only guess. For him I do not know. It may be that in the past he had brought affliction to others. Perhaps by the misuse of his intellect he had brought humiliation upon them. Perhaps his pride had been a scourge upon the weak, or his mockery a prelude to their despair. My grandmother so tormented her household with her tongue, and there are many such as she. The sorrows they have caused to others will come upon them at one time. All the petty deceits that others have been put to for fear of them, all the small joys they destroyed, all the needless apprehensions they fostered, small things in themselves, but a mighty enemy together. They would see if I manage it. They will descend like a cloud of stinging flies to make a black pall over him who gave them birth. It may be the hand of a madman which drives the dagger into such a heart, but he made that dagger when he was sane, and he will not forge another of the same metal. You told me of Sophia. What if she killed herself when she had killed herself when she has been possessed? Then it would have not been Sophia, but her possessor who killed her. But why was she possessed? She would not have been if once she had not allowed the bodies of others to suffer that defilement. To me, Carlos, it seems the greatest of all sin to make of one's body a house for devils. Remember, there can be terrible crimes brought to a man's door of which he is innocent. 100 eyes may have seen him drive a knife into the heart of the one he loves, and they will all bear witness to his guilt. Yet it is not he, but the tenant whom he has permitted to lodge within himself, who directed his hand. On earth he will suffer man's penalty for murder. Away from earth he will know that in his flesh he suffers his betrayal of it, and thus he will learn that the ways of sorcery are never trodden by the feet of the wise. Then there is no escape, none by death from life. When I came to your house, there was pain in my body, and it did not diminish when Anna changed my saffron bedgown to one of green, for it was not the silk that felt the pain, but I. How then should I escape from pain by changing one body for another? For it is not the flesh of Carola that feels the pain, but I. My body is only a channel through which I must receive experience, and I shall experience only that which is necessary for the strengthening of my spirit. Wow. Flail of the Angels is the next chapter, which I shall read soon.